I too struggle with the notion of an afterlife. Any of us who have stood at the grave of a loved one have had to ask the question, now what? The idea of this evening is to try to explore this question honestly, find answers, and ask more questions that are either comforting or disconcerting. So, let's begin. My first question, we decided to forego long opening statements. We're going to make this as conversational and respectful and fast-moving as possible. And my first question is going to go to Rabbi Wolpe. David, do you expect to go to heaven?
Not tomorrow. That's the old joke about, the good news is that there's baseball in heaven. The bad news is you're pitching Thursday. So what I would say is that part of the problem of the idea of an afterlife is that we tend to make it far more literal than it needs to be, and as a result it starts to seem ridiculous. I mean, before you entered this world, could you have imagined mountains and tuna fish and teeth and ideas and music? Of course not. It is literally unimaginable. But we make of the idea of another world something that we can imagine and understand, and so we reduce it to nonsense. It's Mark Twain in Letters from Earth. He said that people assume when they go to heaven they're going to lie on green fields and listen to harp music. He says you wouldn't want to do it for 5 minutes while you're alive, but you think you'll be happy for the rest of eternity doing it after you die. And the crux of it is, and I suspect really what this evening will come down to, is do you believe that human beings are entirely material? Are you only made of stuff? Or is there something non-physical? Is there something ethereal and eternal about you, about us, some mystery at the heart of this stuff? And if there is, then there's a possibility, that we'll all, I don't want to say go somewhere, because that assumes that it's spatial. And again, that's the way people think, and the way we think is not necessarily the way the world is. Our minds are much too limited to grasp it. But I'll just close by saying that I always assumed that human beings were more than stuff. And for me, at least, this came home on an emotional level when a little less than 2 years ago, my father died. And as many of you know, it is a Jewish custom when someone's buried to throw dirt on the grave. And I thought this was going to be extraordinarily difficult, to take a shovelful of dirt and throw it on the coffin of somebody that I loved very dearly. But I actually didn't find it nearly as difficult as I anticipated, and the reason is that I knew that whatever was in that coffin, he wasn't there. But I also knew that that wasn't the same thing as he wasn't. It just meant he wasn't there, but he was, and he is. I just don't know how.
Sam, in The End of Faith, you chide scientists who believe that consciousness ends with death. So, picking up a little bit on what David said, you wrote, the place of consciousness in the natural world is very much open to question. The truth is we simply do not know what happens after death. To my mind, this very much leaves the door open for a belief in the afterlife.
Although it doesn't make the traditional beliefs in the afterlife any more plausible. It's not the point I was making there. But it does, that point of not knowing what happens after death is what worries me about this conversation. I've been very worried about this, that all of you have given up a perfectly serviceable Tuesday evening only to hear the four of us tell you every which way that we have no idea what happens after death. Well, I expressed the spirit of my wife, and she was actually able to put me at ease. I'm worried, obviously, about boring all of you, and she said, nothing Hitchens does is ever boring. So I have that going for me. Right. I think we should think about what this concept of the afterlife does. We'll talk about the plausible versions of it and how implausible some of the traditional ones are. But I think, just to give some context, we're living in a world in which 9 million children every year die before they reach the age of 5. Okay, year after year after year. I mean, that is an Asian-style tsunami of the sort you remember from 2004 every 10 days, killing only children before the age of 5. I mean, think about these children, think about their parents. Know that virtually all of these parents are people who believe in God and were praying all the while that their children would be saved. And their prayers were not answered. Now, the afterlife comes into the midst of this reality and as a promise that all of this is going to make sense in the end, that somehow at the end of existence we are going to be all let in on the punchline and have a mighty laugh with Almighty God for eternity. Now, there's no evidence of that, and I think, therefore, this concept of the afterlife really functions as a substitute for wisdom. It functions as a substitute for really absorbing our predicament, which is that everyone is going to die. There are circumstances that are just catastrophically unfair. Evil sometimes wins, and injustice sometimes wins. And the only justice we're going to find in the world is the justice we make. And I think we have an ethical responsibility to absorb this really down to the soles of our feet. And this notion of an afterlife, the happy talk about how it's all going to work out and it's all part of God's plan, is a way of shirking that responsibility. So that's where I am.
Brad, 3 times a day as a religious Jew you would pray the Amidah, where you extol the God who resurrects the dead. It says that right in one of the most standard of Jewish prayers. When you say that, what are you saying? What do you believe you're saying?
So I need to take a couple steps back and make this a running jump rather than a standing jump.
Sure.
As I understand it, rather than simply reducing someone's idea to a caricature, which is easy to do on all sides in this kind of a conversation, we live in an age in which there are different plausible ways of making sense and connecting the dots. One of them is a kind of reductionism in which everything can be explained by its smallest physical components. And once you've explained how inert matter operates, then you create more complex systems, but you've done all your explaining really at the very basic subatomic levels. And that's completely plausible, and you can tell the entire story that way in a reasonable way. I don't think it's the only way one can do it. One can also say that there are intimations all the way down of what others have called, and I think of as mindfulness. And that the mindfulness all the way down emerges at some point into consciousness, which emerges at some point beyond that into something even beyond the consciousness we're aware of. And we have abilities to access it, not necessarily by what we know. And here I have to say, having read the books of the authors here, I agreed with almost everything that everyone wrote. People claim knowledge where they can't possibly know. But what I think we can also claim is intuitions that go beyond what we know. Things like hope and trust and loyalty. We ground our lives in them. So there are people who use the afterlife as a way of evading their responsibility. But I know that I and Rabbi Wolpe have sat at the bedside of people who were able to connect with others because this belief inspired them to live each moment with dignity and connection. So for me, the prayer is literally false. Having lived one life with flat feet and fat thighs, I fervently hope that God does not physically resurrect the dead. Although I will tell you, I'm one of the rabbis dancing in Gadi Levi's dance thing, so I expect to have buns of steel by the time you come back for that. But I think it's a metaphor for saying that there is a oneness of which we are an expression, and that does not cease with our death, and that in some very important way, although not one that is reducible to knowledge, I don't claim to know, but I trust, that we continue beyond the grave.
Thanks. Christopher, what's wrong with that? If a belief in the afterlife helps one, as Brad said, deal with the inevitability of death, maybe this is a good thing.
Well, then anything that made you feel better would be okay, which I'm sorry to say I think is a contemptible viewpoint. Here's the problem with the afterlife fantasy. It's the same as religion in general. If you can't hear, I hope it's not my fault.
Maybe just move the mic.
Why don't you hold it?
All right, how's that? Okay. Well, not to duck the opening question, give myself a chance to repeat my answer. That would mean that anything that made you feel good or better was fine, which I think is a contemptible position, I'm sorry to say. And it would be as good as drugs, for example. And I don't believe, and in fact Marx never said, that religion is just an opiate. But religion and the afterlife fantasy have these things in common. First, they're man-made. That's very important. They represent claims by humans to be able to interpret the divine and to give themselves power by doing so. We all admit we don't know. That's because we can't know. So the people who have to leave the island right away are those who say they do, who for centuries have tyrannized and still do millions of human beings by claiming to hold the keys of heaven and hell. Leading to my second point, religion is totalitarian in its practice and its theory. It claims to know things it can't know, and it claims to have powers it cannot have. It says if you make the right propitiations and the right donations, you may get paradise, and if you don't, you may get an eternity of pain. That includes, by the way, the souls of unbaptized children of the millions who Sam mentioned. Then there's, I'm afraid to say, but you also, as you'd expect from the man-made, the argument of fraud. St. Peter's in Rome was built on the sale of indulgences. That's to say, in return for cash, the promise of a remission of sin and of time in hell or purgatory. There are chantries, actually quite beautiful ones, still all over Europe, still working. Prayers being said for the repose and remission of souls. Pope Benedict, the most reactionary prelate for a considerable time to lead the church, is trying to restore the idea of remission of sin in exchange for donations or other in-kind operations. This is, I'm sorry if it sounds unduly functionalist, but until we've dealt with these questions, we can't have a serious discussion. Now, there's also, I think, a real problem about anything that's eternal. I should probably close with this. It will happen to all of us that at some point you'll get tapped on the shoulder and told, not just that the party's over, but slightly worse, the party's going on, but you have to leave. and it's going on without you. That's the reflection, I think, that most upsets people about their demise. All right then, because it might make us feel better, let's pretend the opposite. Instead, you'll get tapped on the shoulder and told, great news, this party's going on forever, and you can't leave. You've got to stay. The boss says so, and he also insists that you have a good time. I've read about David's father, and I had a bad time when my own father passed on, but the father proposed by monotheism is the father who doesn't die, who reassures his children, don't worry, I'll never leave you. You'll never see the end of me. You'll never get the chance to feel sorry. I'm always there. I'm the absolute ultimate in dictatorship, and in my courts there's no appeal. Do you really think that this would cheer up anyone of sentience or humanity or capable of feeling of irony? I submit it's out of the question.
I just want to say I was completely with you until the end when you got silly on us. And the reason I say that is because you speak about God in the same way that you would speak about a human dictator as though they were equivalent.
Much worse.
Much worse. But it's only worse. It's only worse because of the eternity of it, right? But the characteristics are the same.
No, the absolutism of it.
The absolutism,
The
the
lack of-
characteristics
the lack
are
of
the same.
any- the lack of any appeal.
But that's not.
And the worship of him by his slaves.
Except that that's not at all what any tradition envisions, and even if it did envision it, as you and I think would both agree, the envisioning of traditions of what a god could be are very limited and partial. And so if you want to make it, yes, that it's North Korea forever, then I would say you're belittling the notion of what it means to have a god. You're belittling the notion of what it means to have eternity in, if not bliss, at least reasonable happiness. And it's true that you lose everything in this world, but also it's not at all the case, and you know that it's not the case, that the notion of the afterlife invariably leads to neglect of what is important in this world. Sometimes, in fact, it does the exact opposite. You can take large swaths of belief. You mentioned Marx. Communism, for example, which repudiated the idea of the afterlife and therefore thought you have to create utopia here, and it led it to horrendous misdeeds throughout the 20th century. So the belief in the afterlife can be totalitarian and terrible, but so can the idea that there's nothing after this world and therefore you have to perfect human beings here. It can work both ways.
I wanted to ask you, Christopher, do you really believe that dead is dead? You don't believe in any kind of consciousness going after death? You believe dead is dead?
Okay. The survival of consciousness independent of the brain, which Sam knows more about than I, and we're getting better acquainted with, is quite different from the religious belief in a mandated path by which you can follow or not follow, leading to reward and punishment. Completely different. It's different in the same way as, say, spiritualism was, which wasn't really a religion, but was a very strong, fraudulent movement that not coincidentally flourished after the First World War in the hope of putting people in touch with dead relatives and so forth. Not one single interesting thing ever got said from the other side. Fascinating, you know. Burblings from the beyond, but millions of people pitifully paid attention to it. I guess my answer has to depend on David's point about stuff. We actually know a great deal more than we ever did, than any of our predecessors did, about what stuff we're made of. We know that our DNA gives us enormous amounts in common with other animals, huge amounts. We know that stars had to die. Larry Krauss makes this point very well in his lectures on physics. Stars had to die. One every second blew up, and is still blowing up since the Big Bang. We're made, if you want to call it pretty, from stardust or nuclear waste, depending on your on your analysis. But there's absolutely no reason to think that those molecules would be worth reassembling. That they will rejoin, as do the animals. And as have done the other the species we didn't know about till recently, the other human tribes, the Cro-Magnons, the Neanderthals, the ones that aren't even mentioned in any holy book, they only died out about 20,000 years ago. Who has heaven and hell for them? It's as likely for us as it is, I think, for any other dog, whale, or bacteria. Well, and no more than that.
Sam, what does it mean when you write that you think that consciousness may indeed survive?
Well, there are many odd ways in which consciousness could survive, and you can make a philosophically respectable argument that consciousness could survive the death of the brain. It's by no means the majority opinion in neuroscience or philosophy that it would. For instance, there's a philosopher at Oxford, Nick Bostrom. This is one of the weirder arguments, but still more plausible than the arguments you get from religion. Nick, there's actually very little you have to assume to make this seem somewhat robust. The argument is called the simulation argument, and he argues that we are all very likely not living in a real universe, but living in a simulated universe. And we are being simulated on the hard drives of computers of the future. Now he gets there with a few simple steps. You simply have to acknowledge that consciousness is at bottom the result of information processing at the level of the brain, and there's nothing magical about brains. It could be information processing in a computer of the future. Most scientists think that's true. They don't think there's anything magical about the wet stuff in our heads. And that consciousness is at some point going to be instantiated in computers. Then you simply have to grant that humans of the future will run simulations of the past in the way that we run simulations, Sims games, and then there's just one short move, that simulated universes, almost by definition, will outnumber real universes. And therefore, we are a lot more likely to be among the simulated ancestors than the real ancestors. Now, again, everyone acknowledges it seems a little crazy, but the assumptions that you have to take on board are not so weak. And I would add to this the somewhat disconcerting idea that if, in fact, we are running as a simulation on a computer of the future, this computer could have been built by Mormons or Scientologists who would want to simulate the truth of their religion. And therefore, all religions could be true in this simulated universe. And we could expect to see Jesus coming back on clouds of glory and moving to Missouri as the Mormons expect. So now all of that sounds completely crazy, but it is not as crazy as the version of the afterlife that is really on offer traditionally, which has been actually neatly sidestepped here because it entails the resurrection of the dead. Most people think that the afterlife religion is offering, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, has something to do with the soul floating off the brain into a tunnel of light and into paradise. But that's actually not the canonical afterlife. The canonical afterlife is God has to do the humble work of reassembling us. And I don't want to take more than my allotted time here, but I think we should talk about just how implausible that vision is, because that actually is the vision of Judaism and Christianity and Islam.
I just want to make one quick addendum. There's also, who I thought you were going to talk about, is Galen Strawson. I mean, another Oxford philosopher who says that consciousness is actually so impossible philosophically to figure out that it must be that it exists even in inanimate matter, even though it doesn't seem that way. So I don't think that but let's leave aside how difficult consciousness is to figure out without some sort of either strange hypothesis or spirit. Yes, it's true that much of Judaism talks about resurrection, much of it talks about afterlife, but there are there's a plurality of voices. And I mean, the Talmud says, for example, you assume that the sages are in paradise, but it is not so. In fact, paradise is in the sages. That's not the sort of voice that generally you hear when the literalist view of an afterlife is attacked. And for more on that, I turn to my colleague, Rabbi Brad Artson.
I would actually love for us all to go out to coffee and leave them aside so that we could say things like, wow, that's really interesting, I haven't thought about that. And what do you do with this? Rather than the scoring of points. And so there's a lot of cleverness and there are a lot of quips. But at the end of it, what it sounds like we're saying is that religion is a monolith, and the worst of religion is compared to the best of science, which is fluid and evolving. And I'm halfway there with you. I think one of the greatnesses of science is its capacity to be self-reflective and its capacity to change convictions. But the wreckage of scientific error is fairly impressive, and the diversity of religious thought is also, I think, undergirded, unfortunately, I think in part because we all had bad religious education as kids and we're still in recovery. So,
but Bradley, I want to accept your challenge, but what do you, I mean, is Maimonides the worst of religion? Maimonides came right out and said you have to believe in the resurrection as a literal
Yes, and
truth.
Maimonides also said that what I've written in my book is disguised so that people will, if they need literalism, latch onto it and miss what I'm trying to say. And he also said that we call the world to come because we don't experience it during this lifetime, but eternity exists at the present. And if you attain a right consciousness, you can be in eternity now. So the challenge is, we all come to it with our own different concrete needs, but religion is, I think, far more nuanced. And I guess the plea I would like to offer to you, because the parts of your books, both of you gentlemen, that I agreed with was everything you trashed religion for, it deserves to be trashed for. I have an autistic son, and if I believed in that bully in the sky, I would have to tell Dr. Wexler that I was leaving my employment. But I don't, and I don't think that my tradition, or the Buddhist tradition, or the richness of Hindu tradition, understood in a nuanced and ethical way, is any more problematic than science's capacity to learn from its mistakes and to move on. And the way the Bible is used in my community with my students is, I would hold up as ethical as anywhere else, and a part of that is the recognition that although we do not know, we hold to hopes that orient us and allow us to value each other as of abiding significance.
Which can be done by anyone who repudiates the supernatural. Look, I don't mind attacking religion at its best if you'd rather I do that. I mean, behind the idea of judgment, remember, which is part of the deal of the afterlife and the reward of heaven or hell, is some rough concept of justice, that there's an equalization of the odds against which we struggled when we were alive, that the tears are dried, and that the wrongdoing is punished. Very, very old wellspring of human aspiration. Why do the wicked prosper? I would really like to know. And why, as Hamlet says, so much contumely is heaped on the patient and the meek. Now, the reason why Sam's Oxonian friend disturbs us when he elaborates his theory is we don't like to think that we're just digitized by someone else's brain, that we're rats in some maze, someone else's maze. Nor, though, rather interestingly, do we like to think that everything that happens to us is random. We repudiate both ideas. They're both equally distressing. But the reason why I started with my totalitarian point is this. Take the case that I still can't get out of my mind. You remember reading about it, the woman in Austria who was kept in a cellar by her father for 30 years and raped every day and bore him children who he raped also. Picture how she must have prayed, how she must have wearied heaven with her prayers, and how accidental was her release that we even know about. You're told those tears will be dried, that'll be compensated. In other words, that has to mean her suffering was part of the plan. We let that happen. Yes, we did know. We do take responsibility. That was part of the design, but it'll be better later. I think that makes her suffering meaningless, and in fact rather obscene. We'll do that to her, but we'll make it up later on. Take another great Austrian, now deceased, born in Braunau on the Inn, and dead in May, I think, 1945. Yes, that was all part of the plan too, but believe me, we'll see to it that he's punished for it. Now, if you don't mind my saying so, Rabbi, that kind of thinking seems to me to materialize both the worst in the concept, the horrible idea of the human being as an experimental object in a design that's opaque to us, where we're played with, and to maximize the horror of randomness. To pick one Austrian, make him very nearly the ruler of the whole of Europe, another Austrian, and keep her as a prisoner of her rapist father for 3 decades. And that's all part of the plan too. So it's maximizing chaos, and it's maximizing tyranny and deliberate cruelty. And that's why I think reason has to repudiate this whole means of thinking. Reason and justice too, I should have added.
As I'm sure it would if religion thought that way, but it doesn't, in fact.
Wait a minute.
No, wait.
Dave, I'll give you your time here, please.
Okay.
That's the move that's really not open to you. If you want to change the subject to a truly purified wisdom tradition that is non-dogmatic, that's just open to mystery, you have to...
No, I'm not going to do that.
Okay, but if you want to follow the path...
You have to hear the move before you repudiate.
No, but I think you're taking the move that Bradley...
You think so, but I might not be.
Well, let me just tell you what I heard you do.
Okay, go ahead.
You just said religion is not the way Christopher suggested it was, and in the vast majority of cases, it is. And so you have to at least admit that we are not caricaturing religion. 50% of Americans think they're going to see their pets in heaven. Okay. I mean, we're dealing.
It wouldn't be heaven if you don't.
Right. We're having this conversation in the context of how religion is practiced.
Soon?
Yes.
Okay.
Please.
There are strains of religion that are deterministic and say that everything that happens in the world is a plan. There are. Calvinism, for example, does that. In Judaism, that's actually very rare. There are a couple of notable thinkers who say that, but almost no notable Jewish thinker believes that what happens here is preordained by God. And in fact, free will and the free will to do horrendous things is built into the system and is the prerequisite of the chance of human beings to both sin and also to do wonderful things. So when you say that God made this man do this, that's all part of the plan, and she's going to be rewarded in the afterlife for the horror that God inflicted on her here, I can, with all good conscience, say, look, I'm not going to speak for the pet envisioning Christians that you speak for. But I will speak certainly for my own tradition and say that that's not actually what Judaism believes. It's not what almost any major Jewish thinker says, and I wouldn't believe it if it did say that. So
that's a great cafeteria to be shopping at. Take your pick.
What do you mean, take your pick? I just said that almost no major Jewish thinker says that, and if they did, I wouldn't agree with them.
Both of you, confronted with Sam's perfectly clear attribution of the words of the Rambam, you said, well, it's as likely that paradise is in the sages as the sages are in paradise.
I didn't say it, the Talmud did.
Yes, right, the Talmud said. And your colleague says, Maimonides writes in order to be misunderstood, and it's deliberately, which is, by the way, I quite agree with the Straussian reading of him that says that that is so. But this is a guide to the perplexed. What you're saying is he wants to intensify perplexity.
Welcome to Judaism.
Yes. He also, look, when you say, for example,
you have this smorgasbord
let me give you a little sample of how Rambam thinks. When it says, for example, in Isaiah that the lion will lay down with the lamb, right? And you know Woody Allen's line that the lion will lay down with the lamb, but one of them won't get much sleep. So,
no, the lamb, actually.
So Rambam says this is not to be understood literally. It means big nations and small nations will dwell together in amity, and you should not think that the order of nature will be overturned. Now, I didn't invent that. It's right there. I can show it. It's the end of Malachim. It's the end of the code of law. And he has a sophisticated understanding of religion. If you say to me, are there people with an unsophisticated understanding of religion? I have no doubt that there are. I even know a few. But you're not sitting with them on a stage. And I don't think it's actually, I don't understand my task to be to defend understandings of religion that I don't adhere to. So I'm happy to argue with you what I understand about religion, but obviously, if I thought mainstream Christianity was the way to understand religion, I'd be a mainstream Christian. Right. And I'm not.
Well, I want to make 2 points in response. I just want to kind of show you all how the sausage of faith gets made. Or at least argued for. I see 2 problems with what you just did, and perhaps you're aware of them. One is that Maimonides actually said that this could not be understood allegorically or in any other way, but literally he came back 25 years later after he had been misunderstood in the Guide to the Perplexed and wrote, I think in his commentary to the Mishnah, that the resurrection is a literal truth, has to be believed in. There may be some caveats there in his theology, but he was talking about bodies being reanimated. The other issue is you made this sort of artful move to the free will loophole. You said people have free will. If a man wants to lock his daughter in a dungeon and have sex with her, God has allowed that because he's given us this rather diabolical freedom. That doesn't cover all of the other suffering for which only God can be responsible if he exists. The 9 million children I just talked about dying every year through cancers and violence and accidents and lack of access to clean water. And this is God's fault if God exists. I mean, either he can do nothing about this, or he doesn't care to. So either he's impotent or evil. I mean, this is the problem that you can't, that free will doesn't get you out of.
David and Brad, I wanted to pick up on that point in the context of this afterlife issue, which is, if you believe in a just God, how could you not believe in a world to come where the good receive benefits and the evil are punished?
Look, the challenge here is everyone has great clarity in the God they don't believe in. And I don't believe in that God either. Right? So,
Well, what's God? But so how do you tell us how you understand gratuitous misfortune visited upon the innocent?
Like being in a debate like this.
Oh. My condolences.
Not forgiven. So, look. This is a talk I give to first-year rabbinical students in congregations all over the country. It is a medieval mistake based on Aristotelian thought that God has to be a simple, unmoved mover, and thereby eternal, omniscient, omnipotent, and omnibenevolent. Right? Those are terms that don't exist in biblical or in rabbinic Hebrew. So I apologize for the way the philosophers kidnapped the traditions, but it's not in the Torah. There is no Hebrew word for omnipotent, meaning all-powerful, and the concept is a nonsense concept.
So you're saying God doesn't have the power to change these things?
Yes, of course that's what I'm saying. I'm saying that what God has is a different kind of power than the power of the dictator that Christopher Hitchens and I both despise. And that what I look to God to be is a persuasive power, more comparable to a teacher or a lover or a parent who teaches and inspires you to be the best by seeing your potential and by giving you the vision and the power to rise to it. But I don't believe in a God who breaks the rules or who can intervene or who can do magic. And the challenge here, wait, may I just say one more thing before you leap on me?
Sure.
It is the 125th anniversary of the birthday of Alfred North Whitehead, my Rebbe. And so in his honor, I tell you the following Hasidic story. The story is told of the Kutzker Rebbe, one of the great masters of the Hasidic tradition, who, walking past someone's home, sees that they're so impoverished they don't have the capacity to have a Shabbat meal. And so he prays for her to have a Shabbat meal magically bestowed upon her. I mean this only metaphorically. And no actual chassid involved in the story itself. So he prays that she should have this miraculous Shabbat dinner given to her, and she does, and he hears a vision which says, because you've intervened in the affairs of this world, you've lost your place in the world to come. And he starts to dance. And he says, when his students question him, he says, for the first time, I'm able to serve God without expectation of reward. That's in mainstream rabbinic tradition. So often I had the sense that what's being criticized is a kind of ignorant abuse of religious nuance. And we certainly know, anyone who's been in an airport has read self-help books that claim to use scientific findings to justify all kinds of stupidities, which I don't think you can hold science responsible for, even though probably numerically there are far more people who have nonsense ideas based on false science as they do in religion. The challenge here is you say it's man-made, and I agree. It is man-made, as is medicine, as is law, but the solution to bad medicine and bad law is not to get rid of it. The solution is to have open discussions and continue to refine it and surpass it. Christopher.
There's a story I was told, not unlike that, but a Roman Catholic priest, actually it couldn't really be any Christian. There's a comparable. This is not my fault.
Just hold the mic. Hold the mic. Yeah.
Okay. There's a comparable story I was told about the death of I think it was a Roman Catholic priest, but it could be any Christian official, really, who gets to St. Peter's Gate and is told, well, you're well done, that good and faithful servant. here's your place, we've been preparing for you in paradise. And he says to St. Peter, but I see that there's terrible suffering and deprivation and misery among the souls in hell. Surely my place is with them, ministering to them. And he's told, you really don't get it, do you? One of the reasons why I like doing this, some people say sometimes, don't I ever get tired of debating with the religious? No, absolutely I don't, because you never know what they're going to say next. Sam and I don't mind being called predictable. It's very easy. We know what we think. We say straight out where we think we know and where we think it's not possible to know, why we don't think there's a supernatural, and so on. But this evening already we've had your suggestion that God is only really a guru, a friend when you're in need. I mean, he wouldn't do anything like bugger around with Job to prove a point. And which, if I now tell you, well, that must mean that that book is not the Word of God, you'd say, well, whoever believed that ever was the Word of God? Let me just tell you something. For hundreds and thousands of years, this kind of discussion would have been in most places impossible to have, or Sam and I would have been having it at the risk of our lives. Religion now comes to us in this smiley face, ingratiating way, because it's had to give so much ground, and because we know so much more. But you've no right to forget the way it behaved when it was strong, and when it really did believe that it had God on its side.
You know, I just want to say, so much of this is the frisson of the rebel, and I just want to read you these two sentences. It's nonsense to pretend, for instance, that at this date there's something daring and original in proclaiming yourself an anarchist, an atheist. The daring thing, or at any rate the unfashionable thing, is to believe in God. That was 2002, Christopher Hitchens, in a review of Evelyn Waugh and George Orwell. And I think that there's some truth to that. It actually is very difficult to argue God in the public square these days.
Since Spinoza, yes.
What's that?
Since Spinoza, yes.
Since Spinoza, yes. Actually, since Hitchens and Harris. But despite the fact that there's no question, there is no question, as has been not only pointed out but easily admitted, that religious thinkers in the 21st century don't actually, if they have good sense, pronounce identical nostrums to religious thinkers in the 2nd century, even though they may use much of the material to explain what they believe. The dilemmas and the essential answers are the same. And the dilemma that we're facing is the extraordinarily difficult realization that when you die, you lose everything. And that's always been true. And everyone has always faced that. And that's, have time for a really short poem?
Yeah.
Hausman, A.E. Hausman, has this kid standing in the town square. He says, "Good people, do you love your lives, and have you ears for sense? Here is a knife like other knives that cost me 18 pence. I need but plunge it in my heart, and down will come the sky, and earth's foundations will depart, and all you folk will die." Right? It's like you lose everything when you die. And that's always been the case. And religion, in one sense, has always realized that, which is why you get, especially in, I'll speak about my own tradition, a tremendous emphasis on making this world better. Which is why you can't build a community without what we would call essentially a welfare state in any Jewish community in the world. Because the understanding is there will always be suffering, there will always be pain, and it's the human job to ameliorate that. We're actually taking the discussion a little bit to a different level, to the consternation of some of my discussion partners, which is to say, look, you all know, for example, let's think about this not as biologists but as physicists. You all know that there's this idea in physics of multiple universes. That is, that right now there is a universe, or many of them, that parallel our own, with maybe slight differences, like maybe there's a universe where Rabbi Artson and I are winning. But other than that, there are these multiple universes. Now, in a world in which it is possible to assume that there are multiple universes that go on at the same time, is it not possible to believe that there are multiple lives for human beings that live in this universe. That's actually, despite the fact that I know you have many problems with religious history and religious doctrine, that's the question we were asked tonight. Is it possible that there's an afterlife? And both from a scientific point of view and from a religious point of view, our affirmation is that it is possible. It's not certain. We don't know what the afterlife is, but it is possible. And if you come out of this discussion opening your mind to the possibility that this world is not all, then we will have won.
David, I want to push you on that, because this was actually my first question to you. What do you see that afterlife as?
Jewish
tradition talks about reincarnation. It talks
no,
about
it does.
Gilgul,
But the Jewish tradition also is deliberately agnostic about the nature of it. So it offers you images. It offers you Gan Eden, the Garden of Eden, about which there's almost no description in the Bible. It says Yeshiva Shamala, that is, you get to study Talmud with God. As one of my Talmud teachers once said, for some people it's heaven, for some people it's hell. But the point is that you know, it's like what Chekhov said. Chekhov said that you only get multiple treatments for a disease when there's no cure for the disease, right? If there's a cure, you got one treatment. You only get multiple images of the afterlife if you don't know what the afterlife is. And at least in the Jewish tradition, no one was so foolish as to be dogmatic and say, this is what the afterlife looks like. I'll rest with what Nabokov has John Shade say in Pale Fire. He says, life is such a surprise, why should death be any less of one?
No, it's very attractive as well as clever what David is trying to do. Saying that it's very attractive as well as very clever what David's trying to do. He's saying
you could stop there.
That saying that it's those of us who doubt the supernatural who have the failure of imagination. And good move. But there's no one who can't play this game. There could be an afterlife and no God. Why not? There could be many gods and no afterlife. There could be a God with a sense of humor where good people went to hell and evil people and evil people carried on as in his initial creation, ruling the roost. I'm willing to imagine, as Princess Leia says in Star Wars. I can quote literature and scripture too. She wants to borrow Harrison's starship, and he's reluctant, and her envoy says, she's prepared to offer you more money than you can imagine. And he says, well, I can imagine quite a lot. I can imagine quite a lot too, but here's what we're meant to discuss, I think. Those who have claimed to know in advance the rules of reward and punishment, and the actual details of the afterlife, people who actually have and continue to rule the mental lives of millions of people, who have to explain away things like Sam's 9 million dead children by saying, well, what happens to their souls? St. Augustine has to come up with an answer. He says they go to limbo. At least if they're not baptized Catholic, that's where they go. So millions of people for hundreds of years thought that's where their children were. A terrible form of sadism and mental serfdom that the church is now considering dropping. But that limbo was really real to people when it was imagined for them by a sadistic North African pseudo-intellectual. So it's not a failure of imagination to say that this use of imagination is perverse. Neither Sam nor I have said it's impossible that there be a post-life existence. We've just said that it's not knowable, not that it's not known. So surely the default position must be that it's those who have ever said that resurrection or an afterlife is a dogma who have the explaining to do. For myself, I'm very open to that. I like surprises.
Brad.
I find myself once again agreeing with everything that Christopher Hitchens said, except
you thought I was clever too?
Except for 1%.
Except for 1%.
And for me, the main reason for an afterlife is frankly not to bring justice about in this world, but I won't have time in this lifetime to read as much as David Wolpe. And I would like to read some of the references that he's able to spit out all the time in such a learned way. Look, you talk about being at a cafeteria, and it does feel to me like we're using a stacked deck. So what religion says in the 2nd century is grist for the mill, and what science said in the 2nd century is, of course, outmoded. And so chronologically, there's this monolith called religion, and then science is only responsible for right now. But even right now, there are credible physicists who are teaching in universities who teach this theory of multiverse. And there are people like Sean Carroll at Cal Poly who say that's not science. You can't prove it, you can't disprove it, so that's nonsense masquerading as science. You can't prove or disprove dark matter or dark energy, but it does make the theory work, right? You can't get quantum gravity to fit with relativity, but they work in their own. So the challenge here is it's a violation, I think, of accuracy to claim that what science does is only affirm what is verifiable or falsifiable. Much of science does that, and it's a very important corrective tool, as I believe it is in most religion today, which is you make a claim, you put it out there, you argue about it, you debate it. But it's not as though these are in opposite camps. So the last thing I want to just state a dissent from is I don't believe that it's that religion lost because science won, because many of the people who have given us the Enlightenment and science were themselves motivated by a desire to read God's text, which is the world. So is there a lot of nonsense that is proposed in the name of religion? For sure. Is it egregious? Absolutely. Every criticism you've made, I think, is despicable and accurate and dead on. But that doesn't taint religion as a whole any more than the notion that you can measure people's craniums and look at their racial feature and then put up a hierarchy of human mattering, which was tenured at Harvard University within the past century, discredits science as a whole. There is every human enterprise that is capable of egregious mistake and of brilliant insight. The last thing I want to say, really the last thing for now, is if you insist on reading Shakespeare literally, then he also would be a dunce, but you would have missed his greatness. And some of the greatest literature in the world, billions of people have thought, were religious literature. I find very inspiring much of religious literature, and I find deeply offensive much of religious literature. But it's literature made by people to make sense of the world and to chart lives of meaning and of value. I think that's good.
Well, does this bloody work? Okay. That at least it obscures my face if it doesn't project my voice. I'd like to be the first to rush to the common ground that's just been offered us, which consists of a very large and quite long admission that religion is man-made, which is our point to begin with. Thank you.
I wanted to veer a little bit back towards the afterlife, or forward to the afterlife, and say, we talked a little bit about that we don't know what happens, and there could be this sense of consciousness existing out of our bodies. Isn't religion, all these concepts of an afterlife, can't we just talk of it in terms of metaphor and kind of agree that religion is the best metaphor, or has provided some metaphors for what the rest of us would call an afterlife? Is that what it amounts to?
I think there's some confusion here. I think there's a real asymmetry between science and religion that shouldn't go unobserved. And there's an effort on the part of David and Bradley to not own the very clear propositional claims that have been made by every religion for millennia. Claims about the way the universe is structured. Very explicit claims about what's going to happen in the future, about what happened in the past, about what happens after death. And these claims are incompatible. So, for instance, if Buddhism is true, Buddhism purports to be true. Buddhism has a doctrine of karma and rebirth. You can be reborn as an animal. You can be reborn in various realms. If Buddhism is true, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam are absolutely false in their core claims. I mean, these are not pictures that can be squared logically. And every religion is in the business of making these claims about the afterlife and about all manner of other things. And the crucial difference between religion and science is that every religion is beholden to its literature and doesn't think, for the most part, apart from the fringe of kind of liberal intelligentsia, for the most part, people don't think it's man-made. They don't think that these are just books. If everyone read the Bible like Shakespeare, Hitch and I would be doing something entirely unrecognizable right now. I mean, there would be no problem. And so the problem we're articulating is everyone has this idea that they have knowledge about the afterlife, the end of days, the virgin birth of certain people, etc. And these are claims to truth, and they are profoundly anti-scientific because you can't edit the books. You can't edit the Quran. You can't edit the Bible. You can't acknowledge freely within the context of the faith that there are just mountains of life-destroying nonsense in these books, and that's a problem.
So talk a little bit, then we'll move on to the next. Yeah, give a brief response.
I want to just say this, that it is undeniable what Sam said about the fact that there are truth claims in different traditions that contradict each other. But here's what I think ought not to go unnoticed. I've been at any number, as almost every clergy has at one time or another, I've been at any number of interfaith conferences. I was just spoke at an interfaith conference in San Diego on labor in different traditions, okay? And it was everything from Native American, there was a Native American dance, there was a Buddhist chant, there was a reading from the Quran, and the Jew talked. So it was a true interfaith conference. And here's what was so interesting about the time that we all spent before we went out on stage to do our dances, either literal or metaphorical. We were all talking about our traditions. We all understood that there were serious differences about part of it, and everybody there, I think in all sincerity, and not just to be nice, agreed that there was a profound core of similarity in these religious traditions, that we saw the world as more than material, that we saw human beings as having a sacred destiny, not only an occupational destiny, that we thought that kindness and goodness was the mandate of whatever force we understood to run the world. I mean, these are serious, and they are truth claims, but they're truth claims that are outside the realm of science. Science can't decide whether there is, in fact, a sacred destiny to your life. It doesn't ask those kinds of questions or give those kinds of answers. Religion does. And the day that you say that all of religion is off the table because, after all, it says in Genesis that the world was created in 7 days and we know that's not true, then what you do is you throw out the very serious, comprehensive, and shared questions of meaning of human life that really, really matter to the way people live, and that you ought not to do.
Okay, I want to talk a little bit about what evidence there is for an afterlife, because when you read books about it, it inevitably comes up that people purport there to be evidence. So I wanted you all to share your thoughts on that. One of the most common tropes is the near-death experience. Yeah. There have been, I think, over the last 3 decades, there's been 40 studies of some 3,400 near-death experiences, and they've been published in journals like Lancet and Annals of American Psychological Journals. And Barbara Haggerty did a book on this called Fingerprints of God, where she interviewed a lot of the people who did these studies that were published in peer-reviewed journals, and a lot of the people she interviewed said that they cannot help but think, after investigating these in a scientific way, that they point to something beyond this life.
I would say almost that was wrong by definition, because it's a near-death experience. It means you didn't die.
But it's the best we have.
No. If someone is reported dead on Tuesday and you see them on Friday, the overwhelming, well, not the obvious conclusion is that the initial report was mistaken. We have no reason to think otherwise. I've read a lot about this stuff. In fact, I have 2, if you care to get the Portable Atheist, which I edited. There are 2 accounts by great philosophers, the late A.J. Ayer and fortunately very current Daniel Dennett, about their own so-called near-death hospital experiences of people who were battling with very grave onslaughts on their health, which I recommend you read for the very confirming rationality that they bring to it. Dinesh D'Souza, who's a frequent debating partner of mine, has written a book about this too, and the most persuasive example from any hospital he's found, and I get it all the time, is a woman who floated out of her body, out of the bed, made a tour of the outside of the hospital,
Saw the shoe.
noticed that there was a running shoe on one of the windowsills, woke up, reported it to a nurse, whose name we've never been told, and who went and looked, and there was the shoe. Now, if that doesn't prove it, I don't know what does. I could hardly be more reassured if I'd been told that it was able to reunite it with its missing pair. NDE is bullshit. It doesn't count. It's not coming back from the dead, nor is it an account of what happens to you when you're gone. It's what can happen to you with the help of life-preserving scientific medicine while you are still alive.
I would just add one thing. This kind of question is still scientifically tractable. People have, reasonably serious people, have tried to study the near-death experience. And this idea of consciousness somehow rising, dissociating from the body and rising to a point above the operating theater and looking down on the body, the phenomenology there is common enough that people seem to think that this is testable. And so some people have put random number generators on the top of cabinets in the operating theater, just on the odd chance that someone comes back saying, I saw this weird digital readout above your cabinets, and it was 35721. That would be very interesting. Now, no one to my knowledge has done that, but this is something we could set up this experiment in advance. It wouldn't be merely anecdotal.
Have they put shoes up there? Because sometimes that...
Well, it's obviously structured along the same lines, but again, there's a reason why we can't make a research program based on that one shoe.
It's about as good as
it's
the
testable,
people.
and there's no data there.
Yeah. But people are just as convinced that they used in past lives to be. It always tends to be a princess, you notice, or a charioteer, or something of this sort. It's as real to them as the rest of their pathetic lives are. But it's subjective, and it's wish fulfilling, and it doesn't count. I'm actually a bit amazed we haven't got to wish fulfillment yet. Could I say a word about that? I mean, Freud, in his Future of an Illusion, says that the connection between our desires and our beliefs in the case of the afterlife is so obvious. It's mankind's oldest and most strong dread. Maybe we could duck the fate that appears to be in store for us. That it's unlike any belief that Sam and I can offer you. Maybe all kinds of discrepancies between scientific views. We cannot promise you things of this kind, as religion always has to people. It doesn't make us morally superior, but it does mean, and we're not particularly happy with what we propose, which is overwhelmingly likely that annihilation and extinction await us. It's just that the overwhelming weight of evidence seems that way. Now, again, to quote Dinesh, he said to me once, well, I can see why people want heaven for themselves, and that's wish fulfilling, and eternal life, even though I think that's a horrible idea myself, but still. But why do they want hell? Why would a wish fulfiller invent the inferno? Well, I think that's pretty obvious. It's for other people to go to. A very old rhyme among English Calvinists was, we are the pure and chosen few, and all the rest are damned. There's room enough in hell for you. We don't want heaven crowned. In fact, in the work of many early church fathers, I'm so glad to find, by the way, that anything written in the first century by religious people doesn't count. And I wish that more ministers of religion would make that concession. But Tertullian and many other Christian fathers thought that one of the pleasures of heaven, because it's always been rather hard to describe them, you ever noticed that? Eating foie gras to the sound of trumpets was the Reverend Sidney Smith's best shot. We know what the Muslims think for men. Apparently for women, do you know what they get? they get their husbands back.
Is that heaven?
Nothing man-made about that, right? But the church, at least the Christian church, I said, no, one of the pleasures of paradise is surveying and relishing the torments of the damned. When we talk about wish fulfillment, we're talking about the very unpleasant primate species to which we belong, and the self-interested fantasies that it will continue to generate. One of which is really...
Go ahead.
Sorry,
Go ahead, Brad.
Two things to say here. The first, I need to confess to the audience. My mother, the atheist, the Freudian psychoanalyst atheist, wants me to tell you that she's rooting for you guys. and the two can play at that kind of clever and cute trick. You know, so you've confessed that the idea of an afterlife is a hideous idea. Well, of course there's a wish fulfillment involved in hoping that we're not accountable and that at the end it's all over. So one can pathologize the other viewpoint, but it's unworthy of you. It seems to me that the test in Jewish tradition is not another person's theology, but their behavior. And that unethical behavior is to be condemned, even if it comes from a good atheist, just as it is to be condemned by someone who claims to cloak it in religious rhetoric. So here's the last religious thing I want to say. At the very core of traditional Judaism is the notion of bechirah, of choice, which means no miracle is so unambiguous that it can't be explained away as secular, and no miracle is so overwhelming that you have to accept it. So you have a perfect example of that. We have this data that suggests that the mind has a far greater range than we have previously admitted that it has. My autistic son is capable of hearing through walls. He'll listen in school to 2 classrooms down, and accurately, we've checked, report what that teacher was saying when his teacher was too boring to listen to. Don't we all wish our brains could do that? And so the expanse of the mind is far beyond what we have described it as being capable of being. So one can look at this data and say, this looks to me like intimations that we do in some key and important way have consciousness that is mediated through our minds but is not limited to our brains. And then it's equally plausible to say, until you're dead, you have no business talking about it. It does feel to me that the irrelevant aspect of this, and the Freudian in me looks at the animus here and says that's what needs to be accounted for, is that for many of us, hope in an afterlife grounds us and gives us direction. And the notion that my grandmother and I are not eternally separate is a source of great and abiding comfort to me.
Do you believe you'll see her?
If by see you want me to walk into something literal
Well, you just
again,
said you're not eternally separate. I don't know what you mean.
I'm using a metaphor because I think we are packets of energy. Look, I get that from physics as well. We are packets of energy, and I don't think those packets of energy are necessarily limited to our body. And the last thing I have to say, just to clear my reputation here, at no point did I say that first century literature was irrelevant. What I said is it's not meant to be taken literally.
I want to piggyback on what Brad said.
That's not what it said.
We've gone around this several times, almost every time that Christopher and I have debated, which is now several times. I've made this same point, but obviously to no effect. So either the point is not good or the point is not good. But I want to make it anyway. Listen, when someone explains their own beliefs by reason and explains your belief by psychology, you actually don't have to listen to them. Because this is what happens to religious people all the time. I'm an atheist because I'm strong and rational and thoughtful. You're about wish fulfillment. And therefore, religious people are by definition weaker, less sophisticated. We understand, you shouldn't be religious, but I understand you need it. There are people who believe in the afterlife who are weak and fearful, and people who believe in the afterlife who are courageous and strong. There are atheists who are weak and fearful. There are atheists who are courageous and strong. It is an unworthy argument to say that someone believes in something because of wish fulfillment as opposed to someone believes in something because it makes sense or it doesn't make sense. That's not the way you ought to argue about religion or anything else.
David, Bradley just said that his belief in an afterlife is predicated on the effect this belief has in his life. It gives him hope. He finds it immensely consoling.
Is that why you believe in the afterlife? I'm just curious.
No, but it is one of the benefits of it.
Okay,
right.
so
it has a consequence, but that doesn't mean that that's why. Look, I find it enormously consoling and wonderful to think that my daughter loves me. But I don't believe it because I find it enormously consoling. I believe it because she does.
Okay.
She's a teenager.
You do, right? Okay, just a little empirical verification there.
I mean, there's a false assumption about science operating here. Science is not in principle committed to the idea that there's no afterlife or that the mind is identical to the brain,
right,
or that materialism is true. Science is completely open to whatever in fact is true. And if it's true that the consciousness is being run like software on the brain and can, by virtue of ectoplasm or something else we don't understand, can be dissociated from the brain at death, that would be part of our growing scientific understanding of the world if we could discover it. Now, and there are ways we could in fact discover that if it were true. The problem is there are very good reasons to think it's not true. And we know this from now 150 years of neurology, where you damage areas of the brain and faculties are lost. And they're clearly, it's not that everyone with brain damage has their soul perfectly intact. They just can't get the words out. Everything about your mind can be damaged by damaging the brain. You can cease to recognize faces. You can cease to know the names of animals, but you still know the names of tools. I mean, the fragmentation in the way in which our mind is parcellated at the level of the brain is not at all intuitive, and there's a lot known about it. And what we're being asked to consider is that you damage one part of the brain and the mind, something about the mind and subjectivity is lost. You damage another and yet more is lost. And yet if you damage the whole thing at death, we can rise off the brain with all our faculties intact, recognizing grandma and speaking English. Now,
David?
And I think a much more important point is if everything you're saying about your religious orientation is true, because you're basically confessing a kind of scientific attitude toward the mysteries of subjectivity and what happens after death, then the usefulness of holding to these traditions and these first-century books I'm completely at a loss. I mean, it seems like you're in the wrong line of work. You should be psychology.
And I'm sorry to say, David, that your shorthand account of our disagreement is a little
self-serving.
A little deceptive. I mean, if you say to me of yourself that the fact that I hold a belief that makes me feel better has nothing to do with why I hold the belief, I might just believe it from you, I suppose. But Freud isn't as crude as you make him sound. He said that to ask people to accept that humanity's oldest fear, that of death, and oldest wish, that of the ability to survive it, has nothing to do with the faith in an afterlife. It's only a coincidence if it makes people feel better. I'm not going to accept that, and you shouldn't be putting it about either. Yeah.
David, you didn't get a chance to respond to the near-death. Does that have any impact on your beliefs?
Well, I'll just say this about near-death experiences. First of all, I would love, I wouldn't like to have one, but I'd love to have one. And I've been operated on several times with the sad result of having nothing other than unconsciousness during the operation. But 8 million people have reported these near-death experiences, according to a Gallup poll in '92, so presumably others have had it since then. The sort of William James' pragmatic test of whether an experience is real is that, in fact, many of them report that they no longer fear death, that their lives have radically changed as a result of it. And the only thing I would say is, do I say that this is proof that there's an afterlife? My answer is no, but. And here's the but. There's this philosopher named Jackson, I think Fred Jackson, who proposed the following experiment. Dennett's commented on it. I don't know if either of you have, but I'd be curious to know what you think. He said, look, let's say you had a brilliant scientist in a room with a black and white television in a black and white room, and the only thing she ever saw was black and white. And she became the world's expert. Her name is Mary in his experiment. She became the world's expert on the physiology of vision. She knew everything about vision, about the neuroscience of vision, about the way the retina works and so on. She knew as much as it is possible to be known. Now, he said, imagine that you turn on the television and it's in color. Has she learned something? In other words, is there something you learn from experience that is not reducible to intellection? And my sense is, yes, she would have learned something if all of a sudden she saw colors that she could not have known if she was an expert in the neuroscience of color. Someone who has a near-death experience is saying to us, I actually learned something from the experience that you can't reduce to, this is some kind of trick that we don't understand yet that your brain did. I'm not willing to say that it's proof of the afterlife, but I'm also not willing to dismiss it with a few laughs and say that all the millions of people who've had this experience and have felt that it gave them important information about life are wrong and foolish.
How does the 8 billion stack up against the people who've been inseminated by UFOs or their pilots?
Well, I think there's probably some overlap.
Or the many. Let me tell you something. Or the many. Many.
I mean, I don't know.
It's certainly nothing compared to those who've seen the Virgin Mary's statues move or bleed. Nothing like.
But does that mean you believe that they, in fact, didn't have such an experience? Is that what you're saying?
No, I think that their experiences are real to me, to them. All I ask is that they keep it to themselves if they possibly can. No, I mean, I knew very well a man named Hugh Montefiore, who was one of the only 2 Jewish boys at an English boarding school, until one day Jesus of Nazareth came into his room and said, "Follow me," which he did for the rest of his life. He ended up as a very senior member of the Church of England, a bishop, in fact. In fact, the Bishop of Birmingham, which, by the way, is the first line of a limerick. And acted throughout as if that was as real to him as anything could be, and wrote some very interesting books indeed. And terribly upset the only other Jewish boy in that school who was left as the only other Jew. But yes, of course I have to grant that these things are real to him. I'm not sure I believe that the mass visions of weeping and bleeding statues are as real. I think there's a lot of collective hallucination.
Right. Well,
and if you ask people to draw what the Virgin looks like when they've only had a vision of her, it's always like the last icon that they saw.
I'm not saying that we should fall down every time terracotta gets wet. I mean, that's not my statement here, and I don't believe in weeping statues. But you anthologized 2 of these experiences. It's just that people gave them different interpretations of them. So I have to think that you actually take these experiences seriously. There's nothing in The Portable Atheist about visions of the Virgin Mary crying, but you put Ayer and Dennett's experience in there. They didn't necessarily think that it proved something about the afterlife, but you must have credited the experiences enough to put it in your book.
Well, sure, because anything that suggests that people are having... NDEs are pretty new, and so are a large number of medical and life-prolonging techniques. I think that's interesting enough in itself. That people can now live long enough or be well-tended enough to have experiences of consciousness that we haven't even begun to study yet. That of course deserves to be taken seriously. But the people who say, oh, all that does, it's not really new, all it proves is what we already knew from the first vision or from the first promise of the divine, are doing what religion always does, assimilating what they can of the discoveries that would otherwise make nonsense of it.
It occurs to me as you're both talking that both of you have faced serious illness in your lives, and I'm wondering if that at all has shaped your view of the afterlife. David?
I actually don't think so. No. It neither mitigated my terror, nor did it, I think, reinforce my faith. I think that although I changed as a person, I don't think that I changed, at least I hope I changed as a person. I don't think I changed belief or the sense that people were more than stuff.
Christopher?
I would say it fractionally increases my contempt for the false consolation element of religion and my dislike for the dictatorial and totalitarian part of it. But I presume what I say by the first is self-evident. But what I mean by the second is it's considered perfectly normal in this society to approach dying people who you don't know, but who are unbelievers, and say, now are you going to change your mind? It's, in fact, it's considered almost a polite question. And as you know, there's a long history of fraud about this. People claim that Darwin had a deathbed recantation. They'd made up lies about Thomas Paine. It goes on all the time. It's a very nasty little history, but there's also a horrible undertone of blackmail to it. People write and say, look, you've got about one chance left now. Aren't you going to take it? I'm writing to you as a friend. They've even tried it on me when I've been very ill and I haven't had quite the vinegar I'd like to have had in a hospital bed. I don't mind, I can take it. But I think there are a lot of people older than myself, iller than myself, perhaps at the risk of seeming conceited, less educated than myself, to whom that's a horrible experience. It's very depressing and alarming to be spoken to in that way. I mean, if Sam and I were to form a core of people to go around religious hospitals, which is what happens in reverse, and say to people who are lying in pain, say, did you say you were Catholic? Yes. Well, look, you may only have a few days left, but you don't have to live them as a serf, you know. Just recognize that that was all bullshit, that the priests have been cheating you. And I guarantee you'll feel better. I don't think that would be very ethical.
Okay, but
I think it would be something of a breach of taste. But if it's in the name of if it's in the name of God, it has a social license. Well, fuck that, is what I say. And will say, if it's my last breath. Thank you.
Fred.
When I was 12, I had what the doctor incorrectly labeled as a terminal inoperable cancer. And the first procedure by which they discovered that was as humiliating a medical procedure as a 12-and-a-half-year-old boy could possibly go through. And raised in a good atheist home, and I don't mean that with any irony, I mean a good atheist home, I had this vision with my eyes of Moses and the children of Israel going through the split sea. Being that I was a good atheist, that passed. It turns out that the terminal sentence was a bit of an exaggeration. So I recovered. The disease came back twice. I've survived it thus far, although I'm a rabbi, so there is some long-term consequence that's debilitating. I was a chaplain at Sloan Kettering, walked into someone's room, and she said, looking at this little 25-year-old kid, you know, what the hell can you possibly say to me? You've never had cancer. And I blurted out, I did too, which was the first time I ever consciously was aware that I had had cancer, even though I had gone to cancer wards and whatever. My point here is that mystical experience did not make me a believer. I didn't have a thing to put it on until I became a believer for other reasons. And then I remembered it and went, oh yeah, there was something there. So the challenge I would like to make is I think that in some important way, we really need to become allies. If you'd like to see me as a psychologist, and I need you to write a short note to my mother before the evening is out, because that will please her no end. You know, I also want to say that I think that that kind of militant literalism is equally offensive and problematic on both sides. I don't recognize myself, and I will say here in this audience that neither Rabbi Wolpe nor I are marginal to the religious experience of the Jewish community here. So that may be both good news and bad news for you. It means you actually have what I think of as secular religious people who are your allies in everything except for the finish line, and that may hurt book sales.
Well, it's to some degree an artifact of Judaism. This is not a problem that Christopher and I run into with evangelicals and Muslims. I mean, it is conceivable to be a Jew and be and a serious Jew, someone who takes their Judaism very seriously, and be even less religious than you are, and to say you don't believe in God, and that is just a frank contradiction within Christianity and Islam at the moment, and it was a frank contradiction certainly at some point in Judaism, and certainly Maimonides seemed to think it was. I think we can concede, however, that that belief in the afterlife, or at least a profession of belief in the afterlife, gives you something to say in the most difficult moments in life to others who are losing someone or who have lost someone. It gives you something to say that an atheist doesn't have, which, if believed by the one who has just lost their child, for instance, is really consoling. I mean, there is nothing better in terms of consolation than to believe that the child you just lost is now someplace perfect and you will be reunited.
Sam, what would you say? I mean, put yourself on the spot. If somebody in that moment asked you, I'm about to die, what's going to happen to me? What would you tell them?
Well, I mean, I think actually this issue of the one who dies is less... Our fear of death, at least as far as I can tell from a sample of one, is not of our own death. And we all go to sleep every night and just disappear. We lose everything. I mean, deep sleep for almost everyone is synonymous with oblivion. I mean, you lose your sensory experience, you forget your life. If you never woke up, you wouldn't notice it. And this is... Many people have noticed this, perhaps most famously the Roman poet Lucretius. If death is synonymous with non-existence, there really is nothing to fear, and slipping into it may feel just as satisfying as slipping into sleep. I mean, there's just that's not what we're worried about. We're worried about the process of dying, perhaps, I mean, the process of being ill and in pain, and we're really worried about losing the people we love while we're alive, and having nothing to think that's consoling in the midst of that bereavement.
I'm really glad to have the chance to disagree with you.
Right.
The problem is quite other. I mean, half my sex life has been lived when I was unconscious. more than half.
What do you mean? You're talking about dreams?
And not all of that was nightmare either. Which is a thing that really does oppress and distress a lot of people, and which is as real to them as waking.
No, I wasn't talking about dreams. I was talking about deep sleep.
No, well, deep sleep.
You have to hold the mic close.
Deep sleep is where they come from, and this is why Hamlet is so well remembered, because when he speaks of the undiscovered country from whose bourne no traveller returns, and he says, I can almost do it. Who would bear the whips and scorns of time, the pangs of disprized love, the law's delay, the insolence of office, and the spurns that patient merit of the unworthy takes, if he himself could his quietus make with the bare bodkin. And then he says, because in that sleep of death, what dreams might come when we have shuffled off this mortal coil. When I speak about annihilation and extinction, I mean just that. I mean, the screen goes blank and that's it.
Right.
That's surely what makes people frightened.
Well, don't you think Lucretius had a point when he talked about...
You're not going to know you're dead, but when you're alive and you're in deep sleep, you can.
But, Hamlet says the exact opposite. He says, makes us bear those ills we have
Yes.
rather than fly to others
Yes.
we know not
That's
of. In
right.
other words, over there are going to be ills too. In other
Yes.
words, there is an afterlife.
Okay, but you're
why-
still
I just
talking
want to put
about
him on the
Yes.
afterlife
Oh, no.
side.
Well, his father's just come back from the afterlife.
So it's
Yeah.
clear. All right, so.
Though
there
he
you go.
still wants some evidence in the next 3 scenes that was...
But can we, I have just
not
a
an
question.
not an apparition.
Since I want to be peaceful about this,
Yes.
can we all agree that whether there's an afterlife or not, the point of life is to live in such a way that you deserve one?
Well, that would be true if there was no God.
I did my best. I did my best. I
That-
can't.
no, which I've already postulated. There could be no God and an afterlife, or an afterlife and no God. If there is a dictator who distributes reward and punishment, then you can never be sure if you're doing a right action or an action born out of fear,
Okay.
or the hope of reward. So no, it's an incitement in a way to immorality, certainly to servility, which is not a moral position to be occupying. No.
I think we're talking slightly at cross purposes here. I'm talking about unconsciousness, just the absolute cessation of any kind of experience. If the prototypical atheist is right, and you just get a dial tone at death, that is what people claim to fear. But as Lucretius pointed out, that is analogous to the time before your birth. You'll no more suffer the eternity after your death than you'll suffer the time before your birth. And there was a time where we're sitting was populated entirely by, I think, Chumash Indians. None of us were here. Okay, now what was that like? Not for the Chumash, for us.
It
didn't bother me.
I was a princess. I was a princess centurion.
Go ahead, Christopher.
On this question of your rabbinical authority, I'd also like to concede, because I would say that someone who says there's no afterlife has said they're not a Christian or a Muslim. And I have found it harder to make that sort of blanket remark about Judaism, even with Rambam's stipulation. It's not an optional thing. It's one of the things it's a mandatory belief. And even with your concession that when you were directly asked, do you expect to see your grandmother again, and you did what very few Jews will do and say, well, she's only metaphorical. I was once asked by the Spertus Institute in Chicago, which is the Jewish university, to give a talk on the question, do Jews have a gene for atheism? And I speculated. The majority of you seem to be yes. I mean, Jews do not make the mistake of saying the Messiah has already come, the crass mistake of saying that. Rambam himself says he will come, but he may tarry. No other religion does this. What's the name for a heretic in Hebrew? Epicurean. They teach people all the pitfalls of Greek philosophy and Hellenism, inviting them to discover the joys of sane. And ever since Spinoza, it seems to me that the Jewish people who probably ought to be doing this, because it was their fault to invent monotheism in the first place, have become the first to transcend it. It can't be coincidence, can it? Just like people say it can't be coincidence so many Jews win the Nobel Prize. I'm serious. Spinoza, Marx, Freud, Einstein, it goes on. And it does seem to be latent in the Jewish demand to ask questions.
Yes, except
So I'm very happy.
It's
much more of a pleasure to debate.
Maurice Samuel, who was a Jewish writer and thinker, said that the reason that the Jews continue to exist is that they refused to quit this world until they figured out what it was about.
Yes. And Leo Strauss says, very seriously, he said the purpose of the Jews is to show there's no such thing as redemption.
The challenge here is, again...
The pathetic Christian illusions are not worth entertaining.
You're invoking, I think, a name that for me suggests something very different. Spinoza called himself God-intoxicated. And it is true that the God with whom he was intoxicated was very different than the literal God of the Bible, although he read the Bible as a political tract that had great relevance for his own time. He used it as a call for freedoms that his own community couldn't see or couldn't understand, and he had a notion of an afterlife. Again, very different than the kind of literalist read that I've heard of, but there is a tradition that goes back to the Talmud as well of rejecting that kind of literalism. Look, the whole rabbinic way of doing midrash, of reading biblical stories against the grain and filling in silences or creating extra, it wouldn't make sense if fundamentalism was the Jewish norm. And I also want to here stand up for the Buddhist traditions, which also talk about an afterlife, but in ways that some Western monotheists would find profoundly disconcerting. But there's a much broader notion, and I think it gets back to what Rabbi Wolpe said, that the notion that there is a meaning which we are capable of discovering, and that it's larger than, although embedded in our cultures, and that we have the capacity to live our lives in harmony with that. Look, for me, that comes in part out of evolution. Our brains have been 14 billion years in the development. Why would we not also trust the intuitions that we live in a universe that's moving towards greater complexity and greater relationship and greater connection?
Thanks. It's basically Facebook is what we're talking about here. So.
Is there an afterlife on Facebook?
Right.
We have to wrap up, but I actually just had one small question, which is, Christopher, how are you feeling?
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you for asking. Well, I'm dying, but so are you. And it gives me the chance, thank you again, to repair what would otherwise have been an ungenerous omission when I was talking about the hateful attitude of so many religious people to sick people. I have had, very involved in my care, a great American, Francis Collins, who's the head of the National Institutes of Health, and who's helped me sequence my genome amazingly, and possibly find a cure for an individualized mutation from which I suffer. Francis is one of the most devout believers I've ever met. In fact, I'm lucky to be his friend because of the religion debate. He's a very sincere and devout Christian, and all he does is say he won't pray for me. And all he does is say he's never seen in his entire medical career anything that he would describe as a miracle cure. And on that, we have one of the nicest armed truces it's ever been my pleasure to observe.
Thank you. That just proves debates like this could be life-saving.
But the short answer is it's a bit early to say. But who can't say that? No one's ever more than a breath away from the end. And we're born into a losing struggle, and we all knew that, or we should, from the beginning. It's just that I have to think about it a bit more. Anyway, thank you so much for coming. I think I can say that for all of us.
Yes. Yeah,
thank you very much. Thank you to the ABU. There you go.
Yeah, we liberals are slippery, it's true.